There are moments in a courtroom that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with obvious drama or visible tension. They begin like any other moment, a name called, a person standing, a file opened on a bench that has seen thousands of files before this one. And then something happens, something is said or done or revealed, and the room changes. Not loudly, not with any single dramatic gesture. It just changes the way a room changes when the weather outside shifts suddenly and everyone feels it without anyone having to say a word. Ryan Ashworth was 22 years old. He had grown up in the kind of house that people in Providence knew about without having been inside it. The Ashworth name was the kind of name that carried weight in certain conversations, the kind of name that appeared on donor lists and in the acknowledgement sections of charity gala programs, and occasionally in the business pages when his father, Gerald Ashworth, made a move significant enough to warrant coverage. Gerald Ashworth had made a great many moves over the course of his career. He had built a real estate and development portfolio that reshaped portions of the Providence skyline. He had opinions about zoning that the city council listened to. He had a box at the stadium and relationships with people whose relationships with other people created a kind of invisible architecture of influence that most cities had and few people talked about openly. Ryan had grown up inside all of that, not as a passive recipient exactly. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, a stupid young man. He was quick and articulate and had a certain social fluency that came from years of being in rooms with adults who expected him to hold his own. He had gone to a good university, had studied finance, had recently joined one of his father's subsidiary companies in what was described as an entry-level role, though the nature of entry-level when your father owns the company is its own kind of fiction. He came to court that morning for reasons that were, on paper, straightforward. He had been cited for reckless driving following an incident on a busy intersection near the waterfront. A witness had reported his vehicle running a red light at speed and narrowly missing a cyclist who had entered the intersection legally. The cyclist had not been injured. The near miss had been significant enough that two other drivers had stopped and one of them had called it in. Ryan had pulled over when the officer arrived, had been cooperative during the stop, and had received the citation without incident. There was a second matter, a citation from 8 months prior, also for a moving violation, that had been paid late and to which a failure to respond penalty had been attached. It had been sitting in the system, accumulating, the way unaddressed things accumulate. He walked in with someone, not a lawyer, or at least not someone who had formally entered an appearance on his behalf. A man in his 50s, well-dressed, who carried himself with the specific authority of someone who was accustomed to accompanying other people into situations and making those situations resolve more favorably. He sat in the front row of the gallery with the air of a person who was close enough to intervene and far enough to maintain deniability. Ryan himself was dressed carefully, not in the way that people dress when they are nervous about a court appearance and want to make a good impression, in the way that people dress when they have been advised by someone who knows about these things. Conservative, appropriate, considered. He sat quietly in the gallery until his name was called, and when he stood, he moved to the front with the composure of someone who had been told to be composed and was executing that instruction reasonably well. Judge Caprio greeted him. He asked him how he was doing. Ryan said he was well, thank you, clear voice, eye contact, the good student response. Judge Caprio looked at the file. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was reading something that required his full attention. Then he looked up. He asked Ryan to tell him about the incident at the waterfront intersection. Ryan said he had been driving and had misjudged the light. He said he thought it was still yellow when he entered the intersection. He said he had not seen the cyclist until he was already through. He said he was grateful no one had been hurt. Judge Caprio asked him how fast he had been going. Ryan said he wasn't certain exactly. Judge Caprio told him what the officer's assessment had been. He said it out loud. He said that at that speed, on that intersection, with a cyclist legally present, the margin between what happened and something irreversible was not large. Ryan said he understood that. Judge Caprio asked him if he really understood it. He said he asked that not to be difficult, but because there was a difference between saying the words and actually holding the reality of them. He asked Ryan whether he had thought about the cyclist afterward, whether he had considered what that person's morning had been, Whether he had sat with the specific fact that another human being had been placed in danger by a choice he made, Ryan was quiet for a moment. He said yes. He said he had thought about it. He said it had shaken him more than he had expected. Judge Caprio nodded. He said that was worth something. He said that the ability to be shaken by the consequences of your actions, even when those consequences didn't fully materialize, was not something everyone had, and it was not something to dismiss. The room was calm. It was going the way these things sometimes went when a young person came in without pretension and engaged honestly, and the conversation found its way to something real. Judge Caprio had a gift for those moments. He could find the human center of almost any situation if the person in front of him was willing to go there. And then the man in the front row of the gallery leaned forward slightly. He didn't stand, he didn't speak loudly, but he said something directed at Ryan, just audible enough to carry to the bench. He said not to worry. He said it was being handled. The room shifted. Judge Caprio looked up from the file. He looked at the man in the front row. He asked very calmly who that was. Ryan said it was a colleague of his father's. He said he was just there for support. Judge Caprio looked at the man directly and said that in his courtroom, observers observed. He said that if the gentleman in the front row had something to contribute to the proceedings, there was a formal process for that which had not been initiated. He said that the commentary from the gallery during an active case was not something he permitted. He said it clearly and without heat, but in a way that established without any ambiguity that the boundary had been located and would not be crossed again. The man sat back. He said nothing further. Judge Caprio returned his attention to Ryan. But something had entered the room with those 3 words from the gallery. It was being handled. 3 words that contained an entire worldview. 3 words that assumed the existence of a mechanism, a back channel, a set of relationships or resources that existed parallel to the official process, and that would, when properly engaged, produce a different outcome than the process itself would produce. It was being handled as if the courtroom were a problem to be managed rather than a proceeding to be participated in. Judge Caprio put his pen down. He said he wanted to talk about something. He said it wasn't directly about the violations in front of him, but that it was relevant to the morning and he thought it needed to be said. He said he had been on this bench for a long time. He said he had seen the full range of what human beings brought into a courtroom: fear and grief and confusion, and genuine remorse and sometimes anger, and sometimes the particular kind of entitlement that came from having moved through life in circumstances where problems were, as he put it, handled. He said that last category was the one that concerned him most. Not because the people in it were necessarily bad people. Often they weren't. Often they were people like Ryan who seemed thoughtful and who engaged genuinely when given the opportunity. But they were people who had grown up surrounded by a certain kind of insulation, a buffer between themselves and consequence, and that insulation had a cost that was not always immediately visible. He said the cost was this. He said that when you grew up believing that problems could be handled, that the right call to the right person could smooth over the rough edges of accountability, you never fully developed your relationship with consequence. He said that relationship was important. He said it was one of the things that shaped a person into someone trustworthy, someone who understood that their choices had weight and that the weight landed somewhere and that the somewhere was often other people. He said that the cyclist at the waterfront intersection was a person with a morning and a destination and a life that extended in all directions from that intersection. He said that person had not consented to being placed in danger. He said that person had no access to whatever mechanism was being described by the phrase it was being handled. He said that person was just someone on a bicycle who had entered a green light legally and had come within feet of a consequence they had done nothing to deserve. He said that was who the law existed to protect. Not abstractly, specifically. That person on that bicycle on that morning, he said that no amount of handling changed what had happened at that intersection. No relationship and no resource and no well-dressed man in the front row of any courtroom altered the physical reality of what a vehicle traveling at that speed through a red light meant for a human being on a bicycle. The law was not a negotiation between the powerful and the system. It was a structure that existed to make the world navigable for everyone, including people who didn't have anyone to make calls on their behalf. The room was absolutely silent. Ryan was standing very still. He was not looking at the man in the front row. He was looking at Judge Caprio with an expression that was harder to read than the ones he had come in with. Something was moving behind it. Judge Caprio said he was going to address the violations now. He said he wanted Ryan to listen not just to the outcomes, but to the reasoning, because the reasoning was the part that he hoped Ryan would carry with him. He went through the reckless driving citation and applied the full fine. He noted the aggravating factors. He noted the presence of a vulnerable road user. He noted the speed. He was precise and methodical and gave no indication that anything other than the facts and the law were informing his decisions. He addressed the prior citation and the accumulated penalties. He applied those as well. He did not reduce them. He explained why each element was what it was. And then he looked at Ryan and said something that the room heard in full silence. He said that Ryan was 22 years old. He said that 22 was young enough that the habits of thought you were forming right now were still forming. He said that was both a vulnerability and an opportunity. He said the vulnerability was that the wrong habits, reinforced long enough, became invisible to the person who had them. He said the opportunity was that it was still early enough to choose differently, to decide that being your father's son was one true thing about you, but that it was not the whole truth and it did not have to determine how you moved through the world. He said he hoped Ryan would go home and think about the cyclist, not as an abstraction, as a person. He said he hoped he would think about what it meant to be responsible for your own choices in a way that didn't require anyone else to handle anything. He said that kind of responsibility was not a burden. He said it was actually the thing that made a person free. Ryan paid the fines. The man in the front row stood when Ryan returned to the gallery, and they exchanged a few quiet words. Ryan nodded. His face was difficult to read, but it was different from the face he had walked in with. Something in it was quieter. Not defeated, quieter. They left together, and the courtroom moved on to the next case and the next person and the next story, and Judge Caprio returned to his file and his pen and his work. In the gallery, a young man who had been waiting for his own case, a college student with a minor citation and a considerable amount of anxiety about the morning, had watched everything. He would say later that he had come in terrified and had left feeling something he hadn't expected. He said he felt like he had witnessed something being defended. He couldn't say exactly what. Something like fairness, he said, but that word felt too small. Something like the idea that everybody's morning mattered, that the cyclist mattered, that he mattered, sitting there in the gallery with his minor citation and his anxiety. He said he felt like the room had been held in a way that included him. He said it was the last thing he had expected from a traffic court on a Wednesday morning. He said he thought about it for a long time afterward. He said some things you witness and they pass through you and leave nothing behind, and some things land somewhere and stay. He said this was the second kind. He said he wasn't entirely sure why. He said maybe it was just that he had needed to see someone hold the line and mean it, and on that particular morning, in that particular room, that was exactly what he got.